Hi, welcome everybody. This is WikiTree Week, and my name is Sandy. We've got Eowyn and the trio here as well in our panel of experts to discuss Beyond the Narrative. And really, Eowyn, Beyond the Narrative is how we do discussions and stories and details beyond birth, marriage, and death, right?
Yeah. Yeah, just expanding beyond, names and dates are great, but a lot of us want to be able to showcase our ancestors in a bit of a more meaningful way. That's what we're here to talk about.
Okay, I've got somebody saying no sound. Can you guys hear us out there? Let's double check. Okay, we're going to go ahead and I'd like to introduce you to our panel of experts. I can't thank you guys enough for being here because these are questions that we have on the daily, right, Alan? The people ask us these questions on the daily, and we answer them over and over and over again. So we have experts here to help us answer the questions. So let me go and introduce each of you. And if you would tell our audience a little bit about yourself. So Sara, I'll let you go first.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So I'm Sara Cochran, otherwise known as the Skeleton Whisperer. I'm in Southern California, but I grew up all over the world, and I got my start really with the pictures and the family stories way back in the 90s. Just listening to what my grandmother had to tell me about her family members, and I was absolutely fascinated and captivated, and here I am.
Okay, and Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Yip. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. It's my honor. I got my start about 30 years ago when I was looking at records I just didn't understand. That's really formed the basis of my work today. I live now in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is north of North Dakota, but I've lived in places right across Canada and actually spent a year in Massachusetts as well.
Thank you. Welcome. Debbie.
All right, I'm Debbie Gurtler. I work at the Family Search Library, which is the building you see behind me, also known as Mecca for genealogists. Everybody should go there once. I got my start in family history back when I was a teenager. I will not say how many years that is, but one of the things that I did was go to my grandma's house and ask her for all kinds of information and write all that down. And then, of course, life happened, but I have loved family history ever since. I've been totally involved with all of that. I am also fluent in Spanish, having lived in South America for over 5 years. So I'm happy to be a part of the panel.
And could you tell us what your background is?
So I have a genealogist degree, bachelor's from Brigham Young University, and I am the assistant director of the Family Search Library. I have credentials in the United States, Mid-South, Mexico, Chile, Portugal, and I'm forgetting one. Somewhere else. Spain. Okay, there you go. Yeah, and so I've been helping people with their family history from around the world. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks and welcome. And David.
Hi, everyone. So my name is David Ryan. I am based in Cork City in Ireland, and that is actually the background I chose behind me. And I see how I kind of got my interest in genealogy from always hearing those family stories growing up, and then I studied history in university, and I guess when I eventually discovered that genealogy was something that I could actually do as a profession, I became kind of looking, how can I apply that training as an historian to family history, to genealogy. So I started off with researching my own family history, and then eventually transitioned into doing it professionally. And I've also worked in oral history as well, which I feel complements my work as a genealogist.
And I would say history really is going to help with the narrative as we go through.
Definitely, yes.
So welcome as well. Kelli, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. My beginning with family history actually came from a story, and it was a written account that my third great grandfather had written in 1901 at the age of 91 years old about his family coming from Scotland. And my name was in the written account. Now, if you want to just get somebody hooked, you talk about 5 or 6 or 7 generations of a family where their name is towards the end of the book. That's where it got me. So, and I'm glad to be here and among this prestigious panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kathryn.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kathryn Lake Hogan, and I
think it might be you that has the echo.
It is, and I don't know why I'm echoing. I'm sorry about that.
And as you guys know, we're live, so
I know
things happen. So don't worry.
All right, I'll figure it out. Okay, so I'm Kathryn Lake Hogan. I live in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. That's right across the river from Detroit, so you can easily find it on a map. I got started in genealogy when I was a Girl Guide leader, and I, with another leader, had to do a badge with the girls on Heritage. So we thought, oh, let's have the girls trace their family tree, but we didn't know what we were doing. So we had to figure it out. And of course, that's when I got hooked. And then, like David, discovered, hey, you can do this as a profession. I went, wow, that's kind of cool. And so I teach people how to research their ancestors in Canada. And I'm also a volunteer with WikiTree on different projects. And I'm always thrilled when we do events like WikiTree Week and all the different challenges throughout the year. They're a lot of fun. So I always feel honored. And when Eowyn and Sandy and Azure asked me to be a part of the events like this. So thank you.
And you were part of my Midnight Madness on a Hangout too. So that's always fun as well. And I understand that you're a team captain on a thon too. Or Wiki Games, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you and welcome as well. And I've got good news for you. Whatever you did, Kathryn, it's fine now.
I have no idea how that happened. Okay, we'll go with it.
We'll definitely go with that. So a couple questions. Oh, now I hear the echo back again. Let's see. So a couple things to let everybody know. We do have questions that we gave the panel in advance. I know that a lot of you probably have questions as well as we get through the questions that we came up with. And I got to tell you, Eowyn really did this, and she found questions that I'm going to mute Kathryn. There we go. So Eowyn found questions that we answer over and over and over again a lot. And they're really good questions. But if we don't answer your questions and we have time at the end of the show, we will definitely try to get to them. So let us know. Enjoy. Please comment. Let us know what you think. Let us know what's going on. And let's go ahead and start. What's going to happen is I'm going to ask a question, and the panelists are going to answer. Not every question will be answered by every panelist because a couple answer it and do a really good job, and there's nothing more to say about it. These are questions that will help you work on your ancestor profiles, or maybe you do notable profiles on WikiTree as well. So let's dig in. We've got a busy hour. So let's just do a little warm question for everybody. And this one you guys can answer as well, okay? So the question is going to be, when you think of a family story that's always stayed with you, what comes to mind and why do you think it resonates? And if each of you could answer this, that would be great. So let's go ahead and start with Sara.
All right. So my Irish grandmother's the one who got me started on all this. So, but I went for the shortest story I could think of, which was called, we refer to it as the Pa, Give Me a Bean. And it's my grandmother's grandparents. And one night at dinner, grandma passes the plate down the table and says, "Hey, Pa, give me a bean." He wants another serving. And a few minutes later, she gets her plate back and there's literally a bean on the plate, which is what she asked for. It just cracks me up every time. And it resonates for one. It's that sense of humor, that kind of dry, literal sense of humor. And I'm a pretty literal person myself, so I think it might be genetic, maybe. But it's a fun little story.
It is. And then David, I'm going to pivot to you.
Well, certainly, in Ireland, I grew up with stories that we were connected to a revolutionary leader back about 100 years ago during the Irish War of Independence, and later during the Irish Civil War. And over the years, I've looked into it. I've read biographies on this individual, and I can connect our families to the same townland within the same parish, but unfortunately, I have yet to be able to find that definitive connection. And I think we all know, as sort of the resident family historians, you always have people in family say, "Oh well, that's good enough. Just say we're related." And of course, we have to say that no, I can't. I can't put it on the tree until I have proof. I understand their eagerness, just fudge it and say, yes, we are definitely related. But I don't think I'd be a very responsible genealogist if I just did that.
The pesky little thing called a source, right?
Yes, always that little elusive source.
That's fine. Debbie, how about you?
All right. So I thought of several, but I'll only share one. So I learned a while back that one of my great-grandfathers on my dad's side was an interpreter with the Native Americans in southern Utah. So he actually spoke the languages and was talking to them. And so I was at the Grand Canyon earlier this summer, and they was watching this video in the visitor center. And what pops up on the screen, the picture that I've seen of my great-grandfather talking to the Indians, and I was just like, oh, that is so cool. And whenever I think about it, I think about my kids. I have 3 children, 2 of which speak multiple languages, and I'm like, now we know where that comes from. I'd come to find out this great-grandfather's father was also and could speak some of the native languages as well. So I just love that I can look at that and see how those language abilities have passed down from generation to generation.
And that's going to be a future question. So that's a really good thing that you mentioned that. Okay. And Linda, how about you?
This was a really good question. I actually came to it last because actually it's the absence of family story that kind of guides my work and is quite common in the community for our ancestors not to have these unifying family stories, these creation sort of stories that tell us who we were. And instead, there's a couple of not quite true themes that run through, such as, my great-grandfather came to work on the railroad. And so my interest in family story that really stays with me is the silence. It's reading the story behind the story and trying to parse out what really happened there. And I have a lot more to say about that subject, but this really resonates through the work that I do. It's never only narrative because that isn't what gets me juiced either. Just the facts. It's always the storytelling.
It's always the storytelling, and I'm glad that you mentioned this. That it's the opposite. It's the silence, because that's going to be a question that we have coming up as well for everybody. And then Kelli.
Yeah, I think one of the stories that really resonated with me, and it kind of led me to gratitude for what my ancestors endured. In the 1920s, my grandfather's family, my maternal grandfather, came from Tennessee to work on the railroad in Ohio, and that's where I live now, is Ohio. And I remember he lived in that same town, most of his life, and we'd drive around and he would talk about places and tell me stories about buildings. And it wasn't until I saw one of the census documents that I realized, he had been in an upstairs, downstairs apartment with 14 other people as they were trying to make it here in Ohio. They came from poverty in Tennessee, and they were working, most of the adults were working on the railroad. And 4 generations, 14 people in this apartment, and sometimes I think, we think about our house isn't big enough, or, we want a different car, or, we have a lot of things that are part of our present experience. And it was always helpful for me to hear what my ancestors endured in order for even me to be here. So I think that's what's the most meaningful thing to me about a story.
And you're so right, because if they saw our life now, back then, they would probably think, this is unbelievable that I can give this next generation this opportunity where they could have the multiple TVs in the house, the multiple cars, multiple computers. So just the computers alone would probably impress them. And Kathryn.
So I kind of have a little bit of both. Like on my dad's side of the family, no one really talked about the family history, because I can remember when I was in grade 10 having to do a family history project, and I asked my dad about his grandparents, and he told me they died before he was born, which was a lie.
Oh. Okay.
Right? Later, I'm like, wait a minute, Dad, why'd you lie? Because he didn't get along with his grandparents. That's why. The one set of grandparents, he just did not get along with them at all. And then on my mom's side of the family, we had more stories. And the one story about my grandfather that really got me hooked is that in the fall of 1919, when my grandfather was 25, in the space of 3 weeks, he became a father, a widower, and he was laid off from work.
Wow.
And I have his original pink slip, like actual pink slip from the Pembrokeshire dock in 1919. So those types of things are what really got me interested into digging more into the stories of our ancestors.
That's really amazing too. And having those documents helps you build that story and provide the source as you go through everything. I'm just going to add real quickly that this really hits home for me for a reason very similar to David. My paternal line came to U.S. because of a Hessian soldier came to fight in the American Revolution, which is a big celebration coming up next year. And his brother was so close to him that he came to the U.S. in a barrel and stayed in the barrel on the ship the entire voyage. Was not allowed out and had to have his meals there and things like that. And going on. So I've lived with the story, and as Debbie said, I'm not going to admit how many years, but I've lived with the story for decades. And all along in the back of my head, like David, I need a source. I need proof. I need something, because this is beyond ridiculous. So as I've gone to try and prove and use a little bit of DNA and other things to try and prove this story false, I've been kind of attacked for breaking the family story that is so beloved. And this is another thing that we do as genealogists. We think that we're so great. Look what I've done. I've discovered and I've helped this story break the story as baloney, pretty much. And then you don't expect the attack. You expect, oh wow, that's really cool. You helped, you did this. So there's a lot of things to think about as we do these narratives, and we're going to dig into all these questions. Okay, so this is going to be a 2-hour speed round. Let's go ahead and dig in after the warm-up. So the first question I'm going to open up to all of our experts here. Why do you think storytelling is such a vital part of family history beyond just recording the names and dates? If we're genealogists and we're looking at sources, we have to have sources to prove the birth and the marriage and the deaths. That's really what we do. Isn't that all I need? Do I need anything else? Who wants to go?
Well,
I will. Go ahead, Star. I think that, the names and dates and places are good, but the stories are what add flesh to the bones, is what makes their lives come alive, so to speak. It's how we get to know them and their personality. And so it's really important that we add the stories that go with those names and dates.
Alongside the pictures, the stories are what makes them real people. They're not just names and dates and abstract concepts. They're genuine people, and we can see where our personalities kind of come down from that a little bit, like, oh yeah, you're really literal, give me A, bean, or that strength of endurance, the times when it's like, this is really, really hard situation for me to deal with. And then you can kind of think back like, okay, but my great grandmother got on a ship in 1907 with 2 little kids and no language skills, no English to speak of, and went halfway across the world. If they can do it, maybe I can make it through this thing too. So it helps inspire us to keep going and to find those traits within ourselves.
And I think as well that maybe stories are often the starting point to the research, because as we were all saying during the introduction, it's often those stories which inspired us to start researching. And particularly in Ireland, that we're well known as this nation of storytellers. And of course, a big part of that is because of our history, because the sources were, the written sources were compiled by those in power, and oftentimes, being able to tell our own stories in our own language was a way of, I suppose, kind of a passive rebellion.
You do make a very good point, in your own language, in your own context. And even if we take, I'll take Ireland versus England, those are going to be different contexts, different stories. If you take Germany with all the different localities that they are, somebody from the north versus the south will have a different story. And along with the US, we all have different ways that we speak as well, in our grammar that relates to our ancestors. So if I come from a poor group of farmers, but I have somebody that maybe is a Harvard graduate writing the story, I think it's also important to write in your own voice from your own family line. Do you guys agree?
Oh, yes.
Definitely.
Well, actually, ripping off what David and what you just said, Sandy, the storytelling is important in genealogy because it actually can guide you to look where other stories haven't gone before. If you can understand, and being human, relatable, and understandable is what storytelling gives to genealogy, but it is also a guide in, if, for example, they immigrated, then to look for passenger lists. And if they went on a farm, then you might be able to find a homestead record. Like, understanding their story actually leads to records.
You're so right. And I think that it's important that everybody understands that our stories about ourselves are gone unless we also document them.
True.
So we talk about our ancestors, but also in the present. Okay, so the next question that we have for you guys: what are the common mistakes people make when trying to turn genealogy into narrative? And I want to mention real quick that we're going to talk about fictional narratives as well, and a little bit more detail of what some of the mistakes are. But if you would just give us an overview of what are the common mistakes, because we're going to drill down and dig into this a little bit deeper. Who would like to go first? Yeah.
I'll just mention, one thing that people struggle with and ends up being a mistake is that they don't know where to start or how to start and where to end on a story that doesn't really have an end. And so they don't do it at all. And so I think, sometimes the common mistake is not starting, not documenting, not writing at least a little bit of what you know. If you're missing the middle, that's okay, and adding to it over time. I think that's one of the biggest things.
Yeah.
I'll add to that. I think sometimes people feel that they need to put like everything, every little detail into the story, and then they get overwhelmed. And you don't have to do every little detail. Instead take one aspect of that story and then break it down and add a couple of details to it. You don't have to describe every little thing about it, but you can add enough that people get the gist of it. And then it adds to your story without overwhelming you as the author, but also not overwhelming your audience and encumbering them with so much detail that they lose, they lose the narrative.
And lose interest, probably. They stop reading after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll hop in and say, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, just remember who your audience is. As genealogists, we're used to writing very dry sounding reports about what we found sometimes. And, remember that we're writing for our families and our 10-year-old granddaughters that are not going to want to know about that. They're going to want to know the fun stuff and the stories. So just making sure you include the emotion and you include the human foibles that our ancestors made as well, make them seem real rather than, I agree having a structure, but make an outline, but making sure that it brings more of a mental picture for them so that they can really relate.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's a question coming up, that will speak to what happens if it's not all good to say. So there's a question coming up with that. That's really going to be tricky, and I would love to hear everybody's response to that. Okay, let me move. Oh,
I'll
one more.
quickly, just sticking too close to time and date. It doesn't have to start at the beginning temporally and then go to the end temporally. You can start a story at the end, the middle, or the beginning.
Because sometimes that's all you have, right?
Right.
So as Kelly kind of said too, so if you don't have a beginning, that doesn't mean you need to ignore it.
Right.
As Linda said, start where you can.
And I'm going to toss in, I think the biggest mistake we make is that we think one more record.
Oh.
Right. We don't put down the research pen. We don't start writing. The research, ladies and gentlemen, is never going to be finished. Right? As you go, and it'll fall into place.
And you might discover a document that you would have never thought, like, do we actually need 15 marriage certificate sources for the same marriage and same date? So that's a good point. Okay. So the next question that we have, how can researchers uncover the personality of an ancestor and not just their facts? And I want to just say, when we talk about researchers, we're all researchers. Everybody that's looking at their family tree, from the kid in school that has that assignment to do their family tree, to the person who's a senior retired looking at doing their family tree from the very first time. So how can we uncover a personality just based on sources that are dry facts?
So one of the things that I would recommend is that you look at the historical context of where they're living, what they're doing, what's going on in their neighborhood, because I think that can add a lot of context to their life, and also maybe get to know their personality a little bit better. If everybody else in the neighborhood was a farmer and they're something different, that's kind of interesting. Putting them in their context, I think, can help.
And I think maybe along with context is to maybe also try to imagine ourselves in their shoes. So, for example, I think we've all come across those records of high infant death mortality in families, in previous decades, and we can maybe sometimes we'll tend to assume that because it was so common, it didn't affect them in the same way that it would us. But we have to remember that just because it was common doesn't mean that they didn't hurt. Maybe they weren't able to express it in the same way that we can. We can go online and create nice memorial pages and all sorts of things. How did they express their grief? So maybe start thinking about, are there is there maybe a memorial in a nearby church, or maybe start thinking about what ways did they have for I suppose expressing their emotion.
Mm-hmm. I think too, reading the records that they do leave us, whether that's a will or newspaper, especially things like newspapers, but look at the bequests that they're leaving in a will. I have an ancestor who left some, a little bit of money to this. She was Catholic, so to this church and to this father and to this nun over there. And I went and researched the people that she left money to, and it was a woman who ran an orphanage, the local priest. So looking at the things that they're involved in, the community groups, the church groups. And what do those groups believe in? What kinds of projects do they like to do? What kind of modern time lineage societies? If somebody's a member of, say, the Daughters or Sons of the American Revolution, these are community service groups. So that can kind of guide us into the things that they are really passionate about and what they care about, what they spend their time on and give their money to.
And that's a really great question because the follow-up is this for everybody. What are your favorite sources for adding this color and context to family story? You mentioned local historical societies, things like that. But if we only have dry facts, where can we go to get a little color?
Well, definitely newspapers because they can add a lot of color. Just a sentence or two can add a lot of color to the character and personality of an ancestor. I'll give you an example, a quick example. I have a third great grandfather who was in the workhouse in Boston, Lincolnshire, England. He appeared in the newspaper 3 times, one sentence. Okay. And what I can tell you is this guy was somebody you did not want to mess with. At Crawford Line were some really mean people. Because in one of those articles, one of those little sentences, he beat up the workhouse master for not getting his tobacco. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So David Crawford was not somebody you really wanted to mess with.
So that's some color right there.
That's some color right there. And so, and then talking to other people in the family, and I can see where this personality has trickled down on that line of the family. And then when I interviewed my grandmother about her mother-in-law, her maiden name was Crawford, she said she was the most miserable woman on the planet. She was never satisfied with anything. And then she said, my grandmother said, and one of your aunts is just like her, but don't tell her that.
It's so funny. I recently came across something I wasn't expecting to find, which were letters from the 1840s that my ancestor had written to a friend, and he expressed some regrets about some pain that he'd caused his wife. And putting that together with the newspaper announcement of a bankruptcy, I'm like, okay, maybe this is what he's talking about. And so those types of things will allow me to extrapolate a little bit more on his life experience and what he might have been going through and how he felt about the mistakes that he had made.
Where did you find the letters, or how did the letters come to you?
So there were 2 letters in the middle of his Mexican War veteran or bounty application file that he'd written. And interestingly, there was no letters to the wife, but these 2 letters were embedded in this bounty application file. And also, ironically, for someone who researches extensively in Mexico, he fought in the Mexican-American War and he died in Mexico. Which I only found out about recently.
You bring up a good question. There's indexing going on every day.
I would say searching in the basements and collections of the family hoardings. I love hoardings. Okay, is my favorite unknown source because we do rely on museums and archives, but I study Chinese Canadian, historically excluded, which means sometimes, except for the Family Search Library, which has an excellent collection, archives kind of overlooked our family history. And so my favorite source is really looking for that distant cousin who has an attic full of things.
Yes.
And then ingratiating myself until I can get copies or maybe go visit or and then if there's an opportunity, maybe liaise to get that collection to an archive when the time is appropriate. So my favorite source is really sort of extra archival, if that makes sense.
It does. And with the holidays coming up for most of us, Sit at the table and ask, what you got? Who has some photos? Who has some documents? Who has
That's
some
it.
old
Exactly. Who has the stuff?
Yeah.
As the family hoarder, I mean genealogical archivist. Is it really hoarding if it's genealogically significant?
No.
But as the collector, my grandmother became the repository of the stuff, and then it's worked its way down. I'm the custodian of it. So reading, if you are lucky enough to have those things or have cousins who have those things, reading them, because the personality of your ancestors is going to absolutely shine through the things that they're writing, the way that they word things. And if you don't look for other records, like the bounty land applications, I found one bounty land application. This took place 40 years after this woman was married. And she throws her daddy under the proverbial bus. She says, well, my father didn't approve of my marriage, of my husband to be, so we eloped to this other state to get married. I love this lady. I don't know if she's mine, but I like her.
This is amazing, because if we didn't look, we would have never known this as well. So this is amazing. So maybe what I'm hearing from you guys is to dig a little deeper into archives that maybe are not indexed yet. Maybe go to historical societies. They might know of a relative or something of the nature that you are so distant from, you never met. And then when you do go around relatives for parties or events, or just start asking around, I found that if I share a story or share a connection to a notable, that gets the conversation started, and then somebody will say something. Just this week, my mother was talking to my brother on the phone, and he started spouting off some details that he found out about an aunt that he's always known. I'm like, I never knew that. So Linda's all right. Get the conversation started within your own family and start there. That's really great.
And I just wanted to mention there's one really useful source in Ireland for adding a bit of color and context to family stories, and that is the school's folklore collection. So what happened is that in the 1930s, the government said, newly independent states want to sort of, record as much of the stories and culture as possible. So all the primary schools in Ireland were sent out these notebooks. The kids were told, go out, talk to your neighbors, parents, grandparents, just anybody who has some old stories. And I was fortunate that some of my maternal grandfather's younger siblings, who were only about 8 or 9 at the time, they went out, they talked to their grandparents. So suddenly I have this link going back 2 more generations. And like my 2 times great-grandfather on my mother's side is one of, I think, the more interesting individuals in my family, because he was born in the 1850s, right at the end of the Great Famine in Ireland, and he died at 99 years old. So suddenly all that history that he would have witnessed in between.
Mm-hmm. And as we say often, if you don't have the story and share the story, and when they go, the story's gone.
Yep, exactly.
And I'm just going to kind of tag along on that. If you have anyone if you are researching a family where your individuals are part of an oppressed or underrepresented group, the formerly enslaved, there was during the 1930s here in the United States, the Works Project Administration interviewed some of those formerly enslaved people, and those oral histories have been preserved. The survivors of the Holocaust, the Shoah Foundation has worked on an oral history project. The Library of Congress here in the United States has been recording U.S. veterans' stories, and our veterans went all over the world. They may have a story about what happened in Japan or in China or in Mexico or wherever they were, that even if it doesn't directly mention your people, gives you a feel for that experience that your people may have been part of or adjacent to. So absolutely, if you don't have the family stories of your own, look for those projects that are interviewing and saving the stories of other individuals who lived through those same events.
It's very, very true. And I will say that especially in the United States, most high school kids have to do service projects. And my son actually spent 4 years interviewing with a camera, with mostly his phone, but he did get a camera, veterans for the Library of Congress's veteran project. And you will find they just want to be heard. They just want their story out there. They want to know that what they did mattered. And if they're, as you mentioned, this one gentleman had a full family that could have done this, but they just didn't know, or they didn't feel comfortable, or the person, the veteran, didn't feel comfortable sharing directly with the family member. So this allows us to step up and not only be genealogists, but also be charitable and do service projects along the way. Thank you so much for mentioning that. I had totally forgotten that. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And Linda, you kind of mentioned this along with Kelli, but how do you handle gaps in the story when the records are missing or the trail runs cold? So what happens if I have, as Sara mentioned, somebody ran away, eloped, and that's where it ends. I don't have anything else. And it's so good of a story. I get all the way there and then it's a hard stop.
Kelli, do you want to go first?
Sure. Sometimes I solve that in my writing by making threads between ancestors. So I don't always tell a linear story of one person or one couple. I generally tell a story that has a thread amongst multiple ancestors. And so it doesn't appear that things are missing as much as if you were telling a linear story and all of a sudden you have up through 1820 and then you jump to 1880, you know? So like, for example, I've written a story about my two grandmothers. And so there were some records that I didn't have for one of my grandmothers that I did have for the other. And the story just kind of weaves back and forth with these two women who are important to me and my family, and how they lived parallel lives, but how they lived very different lives. One was poverty, one was wealth, one was travel, one was work. You know, it was, one was highly educated, one was not. So how do those things weave back and forth? So sometimes I take care of those gaps or the missing trails by actually looping in more people to write about.
That's really good. That actually makes me think of this story. My great aunt told me this story that she couldn't tell me any details about, but she said, I worked in a factory and I was promoted to supervisor and we made big war machines, but then she wouldn't say anything else. And this story drove me crazy. She was like 20 at the time. And I learned through research and her story that she was very likely a real life Rosie the Riveter, and that she built planes for World War II. This story that I've put together, really relies on three things: the story that she told me, the research that supports it, and then my context about what Rosie the Riveters did. And so because I don't have the facts to connect it, that's the gap in the story, I go one layer over and look at Rosie the Riveters generally. And I look at World War II and I look at how that may have occurred, and I look at employment records. And so what I'm doing is I'm building context specific to my person, and then theorizing that this may have been the story which explains it. But I'm really careful when I'm theorizing a story, because I don't want to say this is what happened to her. I want to say it's a work in progress. It's always a work in progress. The story is unfolding as we tell it.
And again, you just helped me out tremendously, because the follow-up is, how do you balance the creative interpretation with historical accuracy? So we know that your person was a Rosie the Riveter, and maybe she was just too humble to share the details, and it was a tough, difficult time. So we bring in, as you mentioned, the historical accuracy of the time and of the occupation.
Yeah, I think it goes back to historical context, what was going on in the area, what was going on related to what they did, what was it like living in this particular town. All of those historical contexts, I think, can help. I think also learning a little bit more about the records. Why were they created? What was their purpose? And why would my ancestor be in that record? And the stories that might go along with it, I think, can help to fill those gaps and make sure that we're being as accurate as we can be. And I like Linda's suggestion, you say this is likely, or this is one possibility of what her life might have been like based on XYZ. I think prefacing it helps as well.
Yeah, you said
I think
likely. I'm
this is
thinking
actually where-
caveats.
And David, I'd like you to answer this question because, as we know, Irish records.
Yeah, it's but
Are tough.
this can be where oral histories can be so valuable. Because, for example, maybe you don't have the story of your particular ancestor who, say, worked as a riveter or was a farmer or ran a store in a certain area, but maybe you have the story of someone else in a similar situation. And you can maybe get some clues. Say, okay, well, I don't have their story, but this other person who very similar situation, similar background, this is what they experienced. So maybe this is, what my ancestors went through as well. And of course, newspapers can be always invaluable because, maybe you'll see, well, there was a strike in, a factory nearby over, they wanted better wages, better conditions. How would my ancestor, who was working in a nearby factory, how would they have felt about that?
That's a really good answer because, I often, when I first started genealogy, I thought, this is great. I'm going to find things. And then as more records came online, like, this is great. I'm going to find things. And then I go to Ireland for my ancestors and I'm like, whoa, I don't have a lot of information here. So what am I going to do? And that you gave a really good answer on how we can look when we're dealing with our ancestors from a different country or a different area that we're not really familiar with. And also with WikiTree, we have the different country projects that you could reach out to if you have a question about what's going on in that time frame. And they're always willing to help. I know that for me, I struggle with Germany because of all the name changes and all the different locations. So I pivot. I'm not afraid or ashamed to say I don't know. I don't know that area. But if you come to my area and you ever need help, then we'll repay the favor as we go along. So that's a really great answer. Okay, the next one. So what techniques from fiction or journalism? Because as we know, as newspapers have come along, it's all about how to tell a story, right? In the newspapers. So sometimes it's a little added information there. So how can techniques from fiction or journalism help us make a true family story more compelling to read and still accurate? This is a tough one.
Well, I think there's a couple things you can do. It's really look at the records. Like, who else is on the record besides your ancestor? Like, who are the witnesses? Because sometimes those people are other relatives, close friends of the family. Those are some people you can add flavor to your narrative. And then for the Canadian records, we're really fortunate because we get religion on our records. The Canadian government was always curious about the religious affiliation of the population. So our census records always asked about what is your religious affiliation. And then many of the BMDs have the religious denominations of the parties. And so that adds something that you can go and research. Okay, so, what was the Methodist church in the small village where your ancestor was living? How many people in that village all belong to that particular church? And so things like that can add to the gaps in your narrative, and it can just add more to what was happening at the time. And things like, oh, there's a big rift in the religious community at the time. All the people went from the Baptist church to the Methodist church. Well, what happened? So things like that can really add to your story and make it more compelling to read, and add a little bit of interest and place your ancestor in place and time.
Absolutely. I think, you've got the standard journalism questions, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And as genealogists, we need to constantly be asking ourselves and trying to answer the question, why? Why did they do that? Okay, well, because of this. Okay, but why? But why, but why, but why, but why? And then putting ourselves into really drenching ourselves in the records of the time period that we're working in, looking at the newspapers, looking at books that were published, like the travel guides for immigrants that our ancestors would have read. If we're dealing with a war, look at both sides. Historically, newspapers, they were subscription based in the US. So you really, pigeonholed. That this paper is going to really focus from this angle because that's their readership. This newspaper is going to go the other direction because that's their readership. Read both sides. See what the tug of war is going on and where your ancestor falls. And if you're really, really lucky, you might find your ancestor in a subscriber list and you know which one they're reading. And then that add to okay, this is their viewpoint. This is the paper they're going to be reading. And how might that affect things? But adding things like the weather, look at the farmers' almanacs, look at the newspapers published, look at the fashions of the day. What's popular? When is photography coming around? All of those things, kind of immerse yourself in the specific time period your ancestor lived to see the world through their eyes as best you can. That'll really enrich the story of what's happening and what your ancestor might have been thinking and feeling at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in after what Sara just said with 2 quick points. Always have a point in your story, like beginning, middle, end. There should be, it's something that you're trying to say. It's not just a story of narrative. Like there's something, they were poor, but they overcame, for example. In context, I always provide the day of the week on the date, because that tiny detail sometimes makes a big difference. And then when talking about money, I put it in context of what that's worth today, or its buying power today. If you do that with every dollar, especially with wills, the amount of money that then gets deeded to a person suddenly makes sense to the reader. So yeah, those are my tips.
I'm going to add a little question here that in one of my projects on WikiTree, this becomes a question, and you just jogged my memory with this. Is there a such thing called a genealogical biography? So we're talking about making it compelling to read, and there's a lot of questions where a genealogical biography is dry facts mostly, but they're facts, and it does give the narrative, and it does tell us more information, like she did, her father didn't agree to the marriage, so she eloped, and then they went off and they moved here, period. But if we want to make it compelling to read, then is there such thing as just a genealogical biography? Or should we look at it as, we need to look at it as a biography?
In
my
I would say
both.
I would say both, but really look at it as a biography and include the genealogical information. I also think, to make it more compelling, have a hook, as Linda mentioned, or a moral to the story, or a theme that runs throughout the life that will help, And again, I'm going to go back to using my little granddaughter's examples. Know your audience. Who are you pitching this to? If it's your genealogist family, make it really compelling. Give them a good mental picture, a good description. Educate them of what a farmer might have done back in Arkansas in 1850 and what that life might have looked like. Just kind of make it a little bit more compelling. But I do think you could combine a biography with genealogy. I think it should be combined.
I think and with farmers, you can use an agricultural schedule to tell you what they grew.
Right.
Like, who's a farmer and he grew potatoes. Well, he's Irish, so he probably was familiar with growing potatoes. when you blend fiction and journalism, you're blending two very opposing concepts. Journalism is the facts, ma'am, and fiction is the story. But we can blend them together, kind of like historical fiction. It's a pretend story set in a real setting, in a real world. But we're using real people to do that. John Philip Coletta wrote a fabulous book that beautifully does it, called Only a Few Bones. It's a mystery, because something, it's still an open mystery, but it takes place in a historical time period with a real family, but he has to blend in and add in those unknowns because he didn't have a time machine. I would like a time machine.
I know, that would be nice. We're going to switch over
or a crystal ball.
Yeah,
or a functioning Ouija board, since we just
There you go.
over to questions that dig a little bit deeper. Now, these were a little bit more on the generic, on the overall. And these next couple questions are going to be a little bit tougher to answer because we're getting into emotions now as we write about our ancestors and talk about our ancestors along the way. So if anybody has any particular example or anything like that you've struggled with writing for a biography on an ancestor, please let us know. And if we have time at the end, we will try and take a few of those. But keep in mind that it will be just a quick question and answer at the end. And don't give us too many details. This is a safe environment, and this is for all ages broadcast. So let's keep that in mind as well. Okay. So this is a tough one. This is probably one of the most difficult ones I'm going to ask everybody. What role does empathy play in writing about ancestors whose lives or choices you might not fully understand? And we said what role does empathy play, but I'm almost thinking that we should have said lack of empathy at times as well. Does this play? So nobody is perfect, and nobody has that family tree of all perfect individuals. So who wants to tackle this really difficult question, whether it's what role does empathy or lack of empathy? I'll let you guys decide.
So I have an example that I just came across. I'm working on a client project, and it's 1915, and this couple gets married in eastern seaboard of the U.S. And by 1920, they're getting divorced. I want you to think of it especially for the U.S. audience, well, worldwide, really, because what's happening in the middle of between 1915 and 1920, right? World War I, the Great Influenza. It's a very tumultuous time. And somewhere between that happy day they got married and that very sad day when she files for divorce, she's filing for everything you can think of: abuse, alcoholism, inability to provide. He is just not the man she married anymore. And we don't know the whole story. We only know her side. We only know part of her side. But I can't help but think, and I don't know the fellow, I haven't researched him. It was a random example I found. Maybe he was in World War I. Maybe he was in those trenches. Maybe he came back a different man. And this time period, we don't have the resources for veterans that we did then, that we do now, rather. I need to know more, right? But either way, if I just take that as a vacuum, if I just look at the divorce plea and say, oh my gosh, he was this horrible person and how awful and shame on him, and that lack of empathy, no attempt even to understand what might have been happening for him that changed him, hopefully. I wouldn't personally deliberately marry someone like that, but you never know what happens in the past. And then the other side of that is you can have too much empathy, right? You can think, you can feel so badly for him that you forget that his wife and child are being severely affected by this as well. And she's trying to protect herself. She's trying to protect her child. So there is that balance, and really kind of learning as much as you can about the whole picture of what's happening. Either, if you dismiss it as always just a terrible person, or you go too far with the empathy, either way, you skew the story to the point where, it's really a problem when passing that down. And I see that sometimes people are like, oh, my family's just full of ne'er-do-wells, and why would I even bother? Like, well, you don't have the whole story. Maybe we can learn some more and see where that balance really is. Not excusing bad behavior, but at least understanding and having some more compassion for the situation. Sorry, I got on a soapbox there.
No, but you really
I
hit
love that.
something right. You're not excusing the behavior when you write about it, but you're providing the information as it comes to you.
I think it's important to remember that, yeah, we might have those facts, the newspaper, the court, whatever, but we don't know the feelings or the motivations. Was there mental illness involved? We don't know. And I think, we should give them grace and explain it in an empathetic way, just as we hope that our descendants will give us grace for all the mistakes that we make as human beings. But the story needs to be told.
We discuss newspapers and coming from an historically excluded population, I see extreme bias. When we look at authored sources, I try to read authored sources, even if they're extremely biased, extremely racist, with an impartial observer tone. Who is this person? Why are they writing like this? Why is the story being created? What's the point of the story? Why? And so even though I research pejorative terms in newspapers sometimes to get the context of the stories from my community, I'm trying to parse out the gold there. I'm trying to see, for me, it's always the legal, regulatory, and sociological context of what happens in my community. And then if they made bad decisions and they found themselves in jail or on the streets, or the things that I avoid judgment, that that isn't my life. I didn't live the way they had to live, and I'm trying to understand them through biased observation. I have biases, I think it's important to recognize the lack of empathy, perhaps, in a recorded record that we might be using for genealogy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the motivations of the author, whether that's somebody filing a petition for divorce or writing a newspaper article or writing
politics
book or politics. Oh, absolutely. Or even all the way down to writing a will, right? That person is coming into it from their perspective, their bias, their life experience. And we have to try to understand some of that, but no crystal balls, no mind reading abilities. So we always have to allow that we don't have the whole story. We don't know all of it.
And I know that in the U.S., we talk about this a lot. And in the USBH project, which is the United States Black Heritage Project, talks about it. One of the things that a lot of us do, when if you came, particularly your family was in the South, Virginia, let's just pick on Virginia for just a second. The first question that I used to have from clients was, please don't tell me if I have slaveholders in my family. And, to a client, I'm like, that's not something I'm going to hold back, because I'm looking at it as genealogically, this is accuracy going through. Now, I can do that. But what they took from it, is devastating to them. They didn't want to do that. And then it almost ruined their entire family tree experience. So how would you, as professionals, tell clients that you got to know the facts, and it's okay to know the facts because this was history, but still the lack of empathy is there? How would you address this with clients?
I personally address it very much like you do. I'm going to find what I find, and it is what it was, which just means I'm going to find what I find. And it is the facts. What we do with those facts now is what's important. We can take that. I've found enslavers in my husband's family tree. I'm right on the cusp of finding some in mine, because I'm not 100% sure they're my people yet. I'm working on them. But we take that person, we put them in their context of their lives and their times, and we look at the facts, and we can say, oh my gosh, this person was an enslaver. They were a horrible person, and I don't have anything to do with them. I'm going to pretend they not exist. We can do that. Or we can take it and say, okay, my person was an enslaver. That was part of the times. That was part of their life. Maybe I can find a silver lining here. I know you guys are going, what? But research the names of the people who were enslaved on that plantation. Find them in the wills, find them in the land records, see if you can trace down the original records from the enslaver, because they would have kept private records. See if we can turn it around and help those records that our ancestors created, even though we aren't happy they did it, but at least they did it. We can help give those individuals back their identities. We can contribute those records to projects like the 10 Million Name Projects, or on WikiTree, or Beyond Kin. You know, maybe we can take that horrible thing that our ancestors did, but we didn't do it. They did it. We have no control over what they did. But we can maybe find something good to come out of it at the end of the day, without excusing the behavior, without saying, you know, that wasn't cool, guys. But understanding that in the time period in which they lived, in the place where they lived, we can't invoke our own presentism on that. That was acceptable then, whether we agree with it or not. And it's hard. It's really, really hard to say that, because I don't like the fact that anybody in my family tree might have owned another person. I'm not okay with that, but you know, I've probably made decisions they wouldn't agree with too.
And I see, Linda, with your history and in the bias of your culture, that this probably comes up in an almost opposite way of clients come to you and say, I want to know what was done to us. So we have one side that says, please don't tell me if somebody's bad. And then you might have clients that say, I need to understand the full story.
My clients often come to me with, I know nothing. My mother, my father, and my grandparents, they never talked. And, you know, the impact of the untold story still affects us, even if we don't know what it is. You know, it's our genes, it's the things, I'll give you one example. My community, Chinese Canadian, and so the generations of Chinese who grew up under exclusion are really not big risk takers, generally speaking. We're really safety oriented, very family and community oriented, and therefore status seeking, you know, sort of an external validation profile. And so understanding each of these factors, I get it, right? So when clients come to me and say, you know, I really want to know. So I have one very short example. There's a relative in their family, and they are problematic, and nobody likes them. And when they come to family dinners, they take over the conversation, and they're just mean and nasty and just negative. Like, they're a downer. And I researched this particular person's ancestry. I discovered their sad history in a war. I discovered their abandonment story, likely. And I put context to what happened to them at age 7. And so, you know, now they're in their 90s, and they're well and healthy, but they still suffer from that abandonment. So just because nobody knew the story doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you.
I think the term is generational trauma, and it's real.
It is.
Absolutely. My mom tried really hard not to tell me about her family story, but it impacted me. It impacted my sister. And now I know more about that story in the background. And I can, again, doesn't excuse behavior, but it definitely lends that compassion and aids healing. We can have that generational trauma. We can start the healing once we know what it is and we kind of understand it a little better.
And I think we need to be very careful writing narratives to not be biased by that. That's tough. We're humans.
Yeah. And having a writing buddy, somebody who can read it, you know, and kind of, you know, hey, this is really feeling like you're drawing in some presentism. Hey, your bias is really showing. Let's see if we can get this to a little bit more third person. That can really help.
And I will say, sir, thank you for leading into the follow-up that we have. So as Sara mentioned, have you ever found that writing about your ancestors changed the way that you saw them or yourself? And as you mentioned, I think all of us as being humans have some type of generational trauma. We also have some generational successes that we might have that we carry through. Like I can tell you, I very much favor my paternal side because they are very talkative, you know, and my maternal side is not. So that's kind of like how I've led my life to the career I have. So would you guys like to share maybe how this has affected you, whether it is a generational trauma or generational success.
We have an expression in our family, and it's called "that makes sense." And every time we have another story or another discovery about an ancestor, we're like, yeah, that makes sense. You know, it kind of is one more puzzle piece that puts together a much richer picture of what you think you might know. And even my father finding out that his father wasn't his biological father, that was his response to me telling him was, you know, that makes sense. And so I think sometimes it's just that it just pieces things together for us.
Mm-hmm. Now, see, I would add to that if you were telling that story about how you discovered that there was another biological parent, I feel like you need to add, and in our family we say, that makes sense. Because think of it 100 years from now, somebody's reading this biography and they go, I say that too. You know, it will carry through.
Right.
Anyone else have one that they would like to share?
I'll go. So I blog, and initially, so I started about just genealogy and exploring the questions. It's okay to write about the things you don't know. You don't have to write about things that you do know. And when I started, of course, I discovered there was so much more I didn't know than I did, because the family stories didn't seem to make any sense. And now that I tackle the weird mysteries in my community and I research and write about them, blogging is like your public diary, where you invite the public to comment on your interpretation of the story, the facts, the research. And that's, I think it was Sarah who said, have a writing buddy. It's like inviting the world to be your writing buddy. And then, it also invites cousins, distant descendants, to say, wait a second, you're talking about my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my relative, or I knew them. I knew that person, and they share a story. So personally, I don't understand them until I write about them. I can read all the things I want. I can read all the narratives, but until I sit down with words and try to make it make sense on paper, or in my case, a computer, I really don't. It is a necessary part of my story, narrative, genealogy, the story, the writing. So it's integral.
It's your discovery, and then hopefully others will see it. You're very brave to put it out there, because, like you said, you're putting it out there for the world to see.
That's right.
And comment on.
That's right. They could be mean too.
So my mom doesn't always talk about her family history, and I've gotten some things from my grandmother. She gave me a lot of information. One of the things that she never told me was that she actually had given birth to 2 sets of twins during her lifetime, in addition to some other children. But one set of twins didn't survive. One died the day of, and the other died within the week. And my mom is part of that other set of twins. And then when I think about that, and when I think about my mom, who lost her dad when she was a teenager, and I think about, the living conditions, how tough that must have been for the whole family, it makes me more sympathetic, And so when they get a little cranky, you're just like, well, you've had a rough life. That's okay. You're allowed.
If only my kid would think that sometimes.
Seriously.
Okay, let me move on to the next question. And this one is one I get all the time. This one is so popular. What advice would you give to someone who feels their family just doesn't have any interesting stories? And before we started, Sarah popped in first, and I was saying one of the most popular follow-ups to this are the children that die young. And they want to recognize these children that died young, and they don't always have a story. They might have died 6 months or so, or something like that. Or they might say, there's a really good WikiTree friend of mine that I talked to him about his sister, and he goes, they were all just poor farmers. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody cares. So what do we do? How do I convince this guy that you do have interesting stories out there?
All right, I'm going to steal from Doctor Who. BBC, please don't sue me here. But there's an episode of Doctor Who. It's a time traveler. Who doesn't love it, right? Where they go back in time and meet Vincent van Gogh. And of course, they meet him, they try to encourage him, but at the end of the day, his story doesn't change. His death is still his death. And the companion is very sad about this. And the doctor says, look, our stories have lots of good things and lots of bad things. And the good things don't always outweigh the bad things, and the bad things don't always make up for the, cancel out the good things. And I think that's true with our families. So, yeah, our lives are day-to-day drudgery, right? We all think, think about the late pandemic. Write down your pandemic experience. Mine isn't any different than anybody else's. I am just an average person doing average things, trying to survive in an average world. And okay, most people feel that way. Another swipe from Doctor Who. The doctor tells one of his companions, I have never, in all my travels through time and space, met anyone who wasn't important. Your family is important to you. They're important to the community in which they lived. And their life experience, that story is part of the narrative of whatever country they're living in. And it's okay if it's the same as the next door neighbors or very similar to the next door neighbors. The more stories we hear, the more we add to that communal narrative. And you might find as you're writing, like Linda said, as you write, you discover, you pull things together, you see what's happening in a different way than if you're just looking at the various different records. And that's how your family gets interesting. As you're finding all these little details and you're seeing how they fit in their community and in the world experience. So basically keep researching and don't give up on them.
You bring up a point. So if you document how your experience was during the pandemic and nobody documented your neighbors, well, the neighbor's family might not be looking, for anything details, and they find nothing, but they might do a census and say, oh, look who lived next door, and then they'll stumble upon your story. So you never know. So we say cousin bait. Now I'm thinking I need to call it neighbor bait. It might be a little bit more than that. And Kathryn, I know that you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I was going to say I have a lot of this problem on my side of the family. My kids' paternal side of the family, they've got all the interesting ancestors. Mine are a bunch of agricultural laborers from England, like whoopee, farmers. But digging into that actual occupation, what was involved being an agricultural laborer in England, researching those occupations, digging into them can add a little bit of more interest to your family narrative. Looking at a death record, what did they die of? Is it something like phthisis, right, which was tuberculosis? Okay, dive into that. How prevalent was that disease at the time in your ancestors' community? So things like that can really add to the narrative. Even just looking at things like, okay, where were they buried? Okay, well, what history of the cemetery can you find out? Was it the oldest cemetery in the village or the city at the time? So just little things like that can add a little bit more to a narrative when people are feeling like, oh, nobody wants to read about this ancestor. They're boring. They never did anything. They never went anywhere. Or, they're just a bunch of farmers. Little things like that can add more to the story. And I also saw in the chat there people that lived through different times, like the Great Depression, First World War, Second World War, things like that can add to the story. A lot of people don't know that Canadians suffered more during the Great Depression than the Americans did. Why is that? Go look it up and you'll find out why. So little things like you have to look beyond just your ancestor and look at the historical events, the socioeconomic conditions they were living in, the political events at the time. And that helps you to place your ancestor in their place in time, that you can draw those facts out of those other things that you can add to the narrative. And it's going to help you fill in the gaps. It's going to help your story flow. It's going to add some interest. And so when people are reading that narrative, they're going to be like, oh, hopefully you're teaching them something that they didn't know before. And they come away from that like Kelly said, oh, that makes sense. Or, hey, I didn't know that before. Now I do. So just those little things can really help a lot when you're writing out your narrative.
And I think that you're bringing this almost full circle. What David said at the beginning, and especially when we're talking Irish records, you need that history.
Yeah, very important.
Yep.
And actually, I was just thinking that another way to get people to maybe realize that their family history is interesting is to sit down and actually interview them.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I've worked with oral history, sometimes you get people who are a bit hesitant at first, who are like, oh, my family were nobody special. We don't have anything interesting to say. Why would you want to interview me? But then once you get them talking, just those stories start to flow.
Oh, wow.
And by the end of it, they're like, oh wow, well I guess we were interesting. That's maybe you might have someone who was, say, a child in Wexford when JFK visited. Or like my own, my dad's family are from the same village as Ronald Reagan's ancestors. And people in the village still have stories about, when Ronnie Reagan visited. So, you get, sometimes it's just, by sitting down and just taking an interest and talking to somebody, maybe then you can get them to realize that, okay, you know what, our story might be similar to everyone else's, but that doesn't mean that it's not interesting.
And then you just helped me out. Thank you, Dave, for the next question. So you said we might be connected and everything. Do you think every family has a central story? Is there a theme that runs through our generations? And I've heard a lot of you talk about different things like this. And I would just say there is. Is it up to us to find it?
So just like Kelly and Linda have said, the story, that theme is there whether you know it or not. When I was thinking about this, I wrote myself some notes and I kind of said, well, it's tough because, you've got the bias of the person who's telling you the story. Maybe that person doesn't think they're interesting or doesn't think that it doesn't want to share the hard things. They only tell you the happier things. But what about my best friend in college grew up in foster care. She had no idea and she had no way to find out. But yeah, it's there somewhere in the back. It's affecting you one way or another. But we got to keep in mind, it's real. Our ancestors were not impartial people. They were not perfect people. And it's really tough to ferret out kind of the rest of the story as we go. So I think there is, even if we don't know it.
And I think I agree with you. And sometimes it's hard to find, which is why if you know your family really well, your family history and their stories, or even just their migration patterns and the trends in their lives, you can kind of see a general theme running through their lives that kind of jumps out and gives you that central story that, maybe it's one of resilience. They've set up a farm and then disaster happened and they had to pick up and move, and then they set up another place and they picked up and they moved, and maybe it's kind of an unwritten thing, well, when life hands you lemons, you just pick up the lemons and make lemonade and move on. And so, that those types of things, I mentioned earlier about my kids and the languages, I didn't ever really see that until I started digging deeper and found that, oh yeah, this great grandfather had this, oh, and his father had this, and my kids have this. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, and to a certain extent, I have a little bit of ability with language, and so there is some things I think that if you get to know your family and take maybe a broader look at what happened in their lives, you can see a central theme or a central story.
I would say a central story. Yeah, when you don't have story, like your community has untold stories, or there's a lot of generational trauma keeping them silent. Descendants are influenced by what is generally accepted as the story for your community, which is created about your community by biased observers. And so I'll give you one example. They were all sojourners. The Chinese were all sojourners. They didn't have a stake in Canada. They were bachelors. The term is bachelor society, when actually the truth is much more heartbreaking. They were mostly married men who lived lives of desperation and loneliness so that they could support their families, which the laws kept them separated. So just that one piece, which affects the entire community alone, that is a theme, right? That's thematic throughout our community. And so to find a central theme of the community and then to find your story within that framework sometimes is the difficult part, right? You're trying to convince your clients or your people or your audience, as it's been said here, know your audience. You don't want to belabor them with trauma from the get-go. It's like your first date, and the first thing they do is trauma dump on you. You have to moderate that with, resilience, themes of strength, themes of this is the good, right? You have to work hard sometimes to find the good, the lessons in your central story. So to recap, that's the story of things told about you, the story that's within your family that's maybe not true, and then what you find is the narrative truth, which is a little bit of both, plus the things that you found in research.
And if we're biased in any of those steps, we take our family on a left turn instead of straight ahead. We take them down a path that maybe they did not travel.
So the enslavers sort of theme there, you're working against that very strong narrative trope, and then you're trying to find your own family story within it, and then context brings you, the truthier truth or truthiness, as Stephen Colbert says, to your narrative. But always be careful, when you're writing your story. I avoid the word is. I never say is or was. I say likely, purported, suspected, possibly, because you don't know. You're not them. Like even my own husband, I don't know him, and he's in his own head.
No, but that's a fantastic tip. As we're writing our biographies and our narrative, that is a fantastic. Just that, not using that one little word, can really bring the accuracy and leave us a little bit of room for thought as well and more research. So thank you for that. Now, I have, as we're going to have a little bit of time for questions and answers. I've got one more question for the panel, though. And this one, it might stump us. I'm not sure. So let's give it a try and see. Oops, hold on. Let me get it. There we go. For those who share stories publicly, and Linda had mentioned that she does a blog, but I think this might be a little different question. How do you navigate sensitivity and privacy? The web is about privacy, and people overshare, and sometimes they don't want to share with living relatives. So let's say that I am documenting a family, and I've got my mother who's still alive, and I want to share her story. She wants to share her stories, but she's still living, and that's tough. But if I get hit by the donut truck next week, that story is not going to be documented, and I want to do it. How we've got this urge and this craving to document even the living. Who wants to tackle this one?
I think for the living, consent is critical, beyond critical. Send them a rough draft of what you've written. I did this even when I was working with my grandmother, who's now gone, but I was writing up her parents' story, and I sent her a draft, and she made edits. Now, obviously, I'm not going to accept edits that turn into, fibs. Not did that. to that extent, but, you know, find that happy medium. Say, well, I want it to say this, you know, I want to perpetuate this narrative. I'm like, well, that's not the whole story. So maybe we can find that happy medium. But yeah, send them a draft, see what they say, see if it makes sense to them. And sometimes the compromise, you know, especially if you've got a really sensitive situation, maybe somebody wants to tell a story about how she was forced to give up a baby for adoption in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real concern there because that child may be alive and that child might not know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can agree to, okay, I'm going to write the story. This is what it's going to be. We're going to wait until such and such a date to put it out there. We're going to share it within the small community, not, you know, out on the big World Wide Web. Maybe a private group that shares among family members or something like that. But yeah, working together with that living person to draft that narrative and then discuss what the implications may be of putting that there and where it goes would be my tips.
Also considering whose story it is to tell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I work a lot with DNA analysis and writing up unknown parentage or grandparentage or adoption or other sensitive kind of stories, and whose story it really is it to tell, and how broad and how wide, as Sarah was mentioning, you know, should the broadcast be. And, you know, if you discover something in your family or you're writing up something about unknown parentage or misattributed parentage, then where does that go? Does it get added to your public tree on Ancestry? Do you message all of your DNA matches just to tell them that you've discovered something? You know, there's no undo button for a lot of this. And so I think just being measured in our response, and just maybe keeping it to ourselves for a little bit till we figure out what we think is the ethical thing to do as not only professional genealogists, but people who want to do the right thing by people, do no harm. So, but it's a tough thing because in some ways it's my story that I have a new grandpa, but it's really my dad's story. He has a new dad. So where do we go with that? And maybe my dad gets to decide for a while, and that's okay.
I think we need to sit and think at that point. You know what I mean? I don't think this is a moment to sit down and start writing for public. I think we need to sit and maybe think this through. And as Sarah mentioned, talk it out with other family members that are involved. But you really hit home. This really hit. Whose story is it to tell?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I work with clients, and as has been previously mentioned, consent. But to me, there are layers and levels of consent, and it depends on breadth and specifics, as Kelli mentioned. So as a professional, I have a contract, you know, which states, even before that, you know, before I have a slide deck that says, embrace the unknown. Basically, it's buckle up, because genealogy is not for the faint of heart. And so but that's just my preamble. My contract states, you give me permission, you know, to tell the truth as I find it in records. That's the bare minimum of consent. But then when we're working with DNA, there are layers of consent. And even now, when I close out a client, and, you know, I have a part in my contract which says, you know, you allow me, you know, to use some of this in, say, a written journal or a professional review or whatever, but I'm always going to come back and say, this is what I'm thinking, your audience. This is what I want to say. Here's the part of the story that I want to disclose. Here's the medium by which I'm going to disclose it, and let them make that decision. Again, that's consent, right? Consent in the moment. I once had a client give me consent all the way through to the very last part and then withdraw it, because they decided, no, it's too much. And I respect that. I think as genealogists, we are the story keepers. We have a big responsibility to our community to be trustworthy. And we build that when we handle consent, you know, as sensitive as it is, and as difficult. And as much as, no, we would love to be able to tell the story, they do no harm. Kelli, what you said.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my contracts with my clients are very similar. Anything I find is confidential. You know,
Exactly.
anything that's public record is public record. I can't do it. I'm not going to publish the tree I build for them. But if that birth certificate's out there, there's nothing I can do. But the reports, the documents, anything they give me, anything I send back to them, that's all confidential. Now, if I find some really cool example, then I will ask them separately, can I use this really cool example for a presentation? And then they have the choice, or whatever the out medium is. My divorce example, I found that as a result of a client project, but it wasn't part of that project. It was just, I ended up in this set of records. I'm going to go browse and see what else is in here. So that's a one way to, at least for those of us who do teach and do presentations and things like that, it's the way around it. But yeah, Linda's got a really good point. It's all about, and on your audience too. You know, are you going to tell your 10-year-old granddaughter that she has this surprise relation? Maybe when she's, 30. So that audience and that confidentiality and just being kind. Would we want it published about us if it were our story? And thinking
I think that's the key, is putting yourself in their shoes. How would I feel if this were me and this was my, my story? How would I feel about it?
Mm-hmm.
And another thing you need to keep in mind too is the legalities of publishing things about living people. I mean, it's far easier to research living people in the United States than it is in Canada, and our privacy laws are much stricter. So you have to be careful about those things. You can't go publishing everything that you want to about an ancestor that lived in Ontario, Canada. We have much stricter privacy laws for living people, and that's why it's so hard to research living people in Canada. So those types of things really play into it as well. And then, like, following what Sara said, how would you feel about that information being published about you? And then following what Kelli said, who really needs to know? Does the whole wide world need to know that story about a living person, or even a recently deceased person, on a blog, or on even on WikiTree public settings? So all those things really need to be considerations when you want to publish something about a living person. And I'm of the thought that if the person's still living, just don't, or ask. You can ask, but most of the time it's just don't. I just don't publish things about living people, because they have a right to privacy just as much as we have a right to privacy. So we have to really be careful of what we're publishing, where we publish it, and who the audience is, because we don't know, once it's out there, we don't know what happens with that information.
And you'd be amazed how things go viral, things come back. So as you're sitting there at the holiday table, somebody goes up on social media and says, you said what about Uncle Joe? You did this. And then Uncle Joe comes in the room. And he says, who's talking about me, and why is this public? And Uncle Joe might be a very private person, but you thought because he's so private, people need to know more about him. All these are just wrong roads probably to go down as we go through. Okay, we've got a couple questions. Let's see if we've got anybody that needs some help with some narrative as we go along. So one question: if I have diaries or documented stories, is there a way to put them in the tree? So on WikiTree, there are ways to do that, and definitely reach out in the Discord channel. After this, there's a Discord channel for this particular show. But what I want to ask our panelists, do we publish something like diaries? I know as a child, I would not let anybody see my diary. It had that little lock, these people are long gone. Is this something that we truly need to show everybody?
Well, it depends on the kind of diary. So my family had a lot of travel diaries, completely different than here's my heart's desire diary, right? Right. So, a travel diary can give you the map, the context. It took them 19 minutes to get to the next road they saw. It gives you a lot of context to your story, to their lives. And, so that's a different kind of diary. And public, soldiers in wartime kept diaries. And maybe those are a different kind of heartfelt diary, but they also provide some historical context too. So what do you publish or not publish? But if you're going to use diaries, I would say at least transcribe them for your own benefit or for your close family benefit, maybe not for broadcast.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to throw
yeah,
a little legal loop into all of that is copyright. Do you hold the copyright to even publish that? A lot of genealogists, family historians don't consider that, and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. Who has the copyright to that particular diary? Are you legally able to publish it? And if it's a diary of an ancestor and it was an unpublished diary of an ancestor, are the other descendants might have hold equal copyright as you do. So there's some legal implications that you really have to consider when you want to publish a diary or unpublished documents and things like that. So that's something as genealogists we always should be asking ourselves: who holds the copyright to that photograph? Who holds the copyright to that diary? And am I legally allowed to publish it? Because you can get yourself into some big trouble. Because if it's public and someone else in the family sees that diary was published and they wait a minute, I didn't give you permission to to post that somewhere. You can get yourself into some hot water. So you really need to be careful about things like that.
And you're going to help me lead into another question. So what should be done with documents and heirlooms from dead-end family branches that maybe don't have the cousins? So, and of course, I'll keep the heirlooms from our common ancestor, though. So if it's your branch and you're a dead end, and I want to publish pictures of the quilt and maybe some documents, some letters that they wrote between the mother and the son or the mother and the father, can I do this? Should I do this?
Maybe.
Yeah, I know, right?
Maybe. You'd have to look at the copyright laws. So for these dead end branches, okay, what is it that is the person wants to publish? What's the copyright stipulation on that, the time frame? Photos, okay, well, who's the photographer? Because it's not the person who holds the photo that necessarily has the copyright to it. It's the photographer. Is the photographer still living? And I think in Canada, it's like 75 years after the photographer has died before you are legally allowed to publish it. There's a lot of things to consider when even just like a dead end branch, when you think, oh, nobody else is, going to take this on. You never know. So
you never know. Again,
those legal implications, know your copyright laws for where you live or where the document's from. And can you legally publish that information or not? And I know people break the rules all the time. We see it. We see it on WikiTree. We see it on Ancestry. People are posting photographs, and I'm thinking you shouldn't be posting that photograph, from 1974 with your whole class.
That's what I was thinking. The school,
right? Exactly.
Right?
You don't hold copyright to it. Just because you have a copy of the photo, you don't hold copyright to it. So those are things you have to be really careful about.
Yeah, and I'm going to toss in here, just so that we're really clear about this. Posting that photo on Facebook or well, maybe not Facebook, slightly squeakier, but if you're putting it on a public site like the WikiTree or even the Family Search Tree or some of the others, guys, that is considered publishing. So you're thinking, I'm just putting it on my as my profile picture for my ancestry tree. That's not publishing. Technically, yes, it is. So you do need to be mindful of that. But there's the legal issue, right? And we all can go read the legal genealogist blog some more.
Yes.
Every country's got different rules about what's under copyright, what's not, when that expires, what's public domain. But there's also the ethical end of it. Should you post that letter that is technically out of copyright, but really digs into some, that kind of that scandal, that harder piece of the history? And if you do, under what context? Now, as a dead end branch myself, because I have no the cats aren't going to keep my genealogy. They really aren't. You may want to consider, if you have stuff that's kind of that dead end branch, you don't want to keep it anymore, and there really are no other descendants, no distant cousins to pick up stuff, consider donating those materials to a museum or a local archive, or even a college library. U.S. college and university libraries will accept things that relate to their field. If you got an agricultural college, they might be interested in those business records from your great granduncle's dairy creamery, even if the school isn't local. Manuscript collections are fabulous ways to find things. And with the copyright issue, you can put restrictions on that. Say, you know what, don't let anybody reproduce these until such and such a date, just to be super safe on the copyright issue. But people can come look at it and do research with these records. So donating them is a really great way to preserve the records, and that, especially those dead end branches. Because if you let that stuff go to a dumpster, we lose that story. We lose that little piece of the community story and the history. So that's something to think about as well as donation.
So a plug here. So let's talk legacy for just a second. All of us here on WikiTree in this seminar, all of us are the family historians. We're here because we have an interest in family history. You are part of this archival fabric and thread. The stories that you write, your drafts, your work, the things that you've collected should go to an archive. And the reason why it should go to an archive is because you have done at least a cursory look at organizing it. And what an archive needs, and I've had this conversation with the archive that will be taking my work, is organization. They need to know the provenance of the work, touching on what Kathryn is talking about. And what they don't need, right, are 18 boxes of random things. So none of us do, but we work really hard, right, to sort the photos, to figure out the provenance of the quilt, to figure out where the silver cup came from. And so we're part of this big place in history. You know, we tend to think of ourselves as just observers and on the sidelines, but we are part of the story, and it's our work that could consider going to an archive, especially if you have a historic ancestor, right? The same archive that took your ancestor's thing could consider taking your thing, because they're already interested in that history. So if you're thinking about legacy or what am I going to do with the stuff, those are my tips there.
Yeah, and definitely work with whatever repository that you're interested in before you just hand them a bunch of stuff. Make sure they can take it, find out what their rules are, and please consider it. Some require it, most don't, but consider making a monetary donation along with your items, because they're going to pick up expenses to care for those items going into the future. And it's just a kind thing to do.
This kind of reminds me of a story from an Italian that told me that when he died, he didn't want to wait to give all his heirlooms to whoever he might give them to. He was a dead end branch himself. He had no children. And I mentioned, I said, well, my grandmother, before she died, she put little labels on the bottom of things that she wanted. I want this to go to Sally, this to go to Sandy, this to go to Joe. And I said, I thought that was brilliant. And he goes, it's not. And I go, what? It's not. What do you mean it's not? And he goes, give it away now. Watch them enjoy it in their life now. And you can reminisce and tell them the story when you're drinking from that cup or those set of dishes, that this is where I got them. This is how I got them. This is what we did. And this is how we used them. And I think that when we're talking about our stories and our heirlooms, trying to give them a home, this might be the answer between, and whatever they don't want or whatever our really serious good research is, as Linda said, let those find a home so many researchers can find not just your family, but researchers of your culture and your area. And I think that's a brilliant advice, Linda.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have a fun one for you guys. This one is a good one. This is a fun one. So we talked about converting using the dollars from historic to now. Should I change that every year? Because, you know, the money changes. The value of money changes.
Maybe you just want to specify this was the value in 2025.
Yeah.
You know,
That's what I
label it. to save you from the work.
Yeah, that's a lot of busy work. I'd rather research. Yeah, just
Amen, sister.
Yeah. I would say put the date that you did the conversion. And I mean, money changes, but in the next 10, 20 years, it's not going to change so dramatically that it wouldn't be at least a really solid, like, okay, I got the idea that my guy is the poor dirt farmer in the community, or my guy is the big kahuna. He's got, all the land and all the wealth, and he's upper echelon of the, right. That relative to everybody else is still going to hold true. But that's a great question.
We're gonna end with one question that's gonna take us a little bit. And I did ask if anybody needed help with an example of how to write a narrative. And yes, I have in 1880s a young woman relative, age about 13, who was abused by her brother, tried in court, and she was pregnant, had twins. This person wants to record the descendants.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to think about this, because we want our work to be a safe place as well. As many of you have mentioned, know your audience. Let's not hit them real hard. So how do we record acts of crime that might result in descendants? Because these descendants and their descendants in 100 years from now are going to read this information. And this is not easy stuff.
Mm-mm. And definitely a question that's becoming more and more applicable as we discover through DNA that, the paper parent, the person on the birth certificate or in the will, is not the biological. And that's a really tough situation for sure. And the last thing I would do would be to try to over-compassion the abuser. Yeah. Like, no, that's not okay. But you focus a little bit more on her, because there's certainly a story of resilience for her there. And try to stick as much to the facts as you can. I would stick to the facts. I would not try to human, especially him, just as a female. But yeah, that's hard. Oh, that's a rough situation.
I'm thinking that if there are legal documents, say for more details, here are the legal documents. Yeah. Don't transcribe the legal documents. If they do happen to fall off the face of the earth from being archived, so be it. But maybe just link and say, for more details in the story, read here. But I just don't feel that for the descendants and their descendants are going down, that I as Kelly said, is this our place? Maybe we just leave the breadcrumbs.
Well, I think
I like what Sarah said about highlighting how the girl overcame, how she turned her life around, how she made it a positive. She did what she could given the circumstances, and I think focusing on the outcome for her instead of necessarily nothing on the attacker or the abuser.
Yeah, and definitely those breadcrumbs, like this is from the court, and you could maybe add in layers of the social context of what life was like in that time period in the community. Obviously, she's some resilience because she took the darn thing to court. She's like, no, this is not whether she went to court. I mean, as a child, she would have needed somebody to represent her in some way. Who's standing up for her?
Stood up for
somebody is going to that court and saying, hey, this is happening and this is not okay, and we need to deal with it and figure this out. Maybe what happened, if it's determined what happened to him, that did he suffer any consequences for his actions, that adding in those things. Because especially when you're dealing with an interfamily situation like that, that's going to have repercussions down the family. Never mind the DNA end of it and that part, but you're going to have, was there an estrangement in the family? Was this boy kind of left out of the story after that? Sometimes that's how we find these things, is we find this person that we didn't know was part of the family until we discovered this terrible thing that happened. They murdered somebody. They were accused of something. They deserted the army, whatever it is. They did something the family didn't like, and were kind of suddenly nudged out of the narrative, and then we're bringing them back into that story. But I think Kelli, I know you do a lot of DNA work, and these kinds of stories come up for you more than certainly for me.
I think what comes up more often than knowing the nature of conception is guessing at the nature of conception. And so we want to be very careful that we're not labeling something as an assault when it may not have been, because then that's changing what the perception is of that particular other person involved. I'm trying to keep it G-rated for our, our audience here. But, in guessing and writing about conception, I think, again, we're back to caveat. What do we think is likely? What do you think is probable? What do we think is possible? And leaving some things to the imagination of the reader is okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes with something sensitive where there is documentation, it can be handled by putting it in an appendix at the back or referring them to another location where there's more information if they choose to go there. Sometimes that's the better part of it, but
I think with very difficult stories, don't embroider.
Right.
Don't know.
Yeah.
If I was dealing with that particular case that the writer posted, I would say, according to the court documents, X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And let the reader draw their own conclusions. And then focus, as Debbie said, on, and Sara, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking, she went public.
Yeah.
She broke the bounds of silence within families not to ever talk about bad things and shame the family publicly by going to court. They just, that alone, I would write 3 paragraphs on what it would take for an underage woman to do something like that, knowing, right? She could be ousted by her whole family for that one decision. And so that then sets the trail, right, Debbie, for the rest of her life, the rest of her story, the rest of her, the focus is on her. So, don't embroider the actual fact.
Right.
Use the record to say what the fact is. Because anything, as Kelli was saying, any word that you choose, the word assault, is sensitive, political, hot. And so I think the way to bring that emotional tenor down when you're writing is to use the actual record wording. Let the reader then decide.
And as you all have kind of mentioned, then focus on the resiliency of this woman and how she raised her children and led a life after that. And that's where we go beyond the narrative, as we just did for the past 2 hours. And I want to thank each of you. I hope everybody got some insight on how to improve your ancestor profiles. And you're all going to go to WikiTree and start with your parents, your grandparents, whichever ones you want to do, and work your way backwards to start looking at that. I thank you for your insight, for your honesty, for how you handle it in your culture, in your real life, and with your clients. This has been a wonderful 2 hours.
Thank you.
And I guess we will say thank you for joining the WikiTree Week panel. This is day 2. We will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.